meeting you right where you are on your foster care journey. This is the Forgotten Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Forgotten Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Cabe, and I am so happy to be with you. If you are part of the foster care community, passionate about serving, or simply interested in learning more, we are here for you. In every episode of this podcast, you will hear stories from men and women who have experienced foster care to one degree or another. They may have grown up in the system, are caseworkers, foster parents, or others who are here to bring you hope or encouragement. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. And remember, you are not alone. I hope you enjoy the Forgotten Podcast. So Sean, I'm so honored to have you on the show today. Like we were just talking off air, I heard your message, a message you had given to your church family about our responsibility as it relates to caring for others, especially those living in the margins. And I was really so compelled by your message and encouraged to hear because it's so important that we hear from, people all over, but I love to hear from pastors who are clearly passionate about this topic. And so I told my team, I want to see if he would come on the podcast and share more with us. And as I prepped for this interview, I learned more of your backstory and all these pieces started coming together for me. And I'm really, really excited to talk more with you. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Seriously, appreciate the invite.
We also found out, we were talking earlier, that Sean is from Peoria. I'm from Bloomington, but I was thinking he was from Peoria, Illinois, because there is a Peoria, Illinois very near us. But he is from Peoria, Arizona.
Yes.
So very different, very different. Anyway, so Sean, your childhood was filled with instability. You had parents who were addicted to drugs. You experienced homelessness, foster care, police. I just want to say that I'm sorry. I'm sorry that your childhood was filled with so much pain and hardship.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that.
I can't imagine. It's not the way God intended it, right? And yet you're a testimony here today to say that God does beautiful things and he can redeem brokenness. But it's real. So will you help us understand more? What was it like to be a child in this kind of an environment?
Yeah. So, being a pastor, it's interesting now raising kids who are pastors' kids coming from the opposite. So it's a weird, sometimes when I tell my story, my kids are kind of lost in that whole world. So yeah, I didn't grow up in the church at all. Both my parents were drug addicts growing up. They were never together that I remember. So for them, it was just a brief little kind of together moment where they ended up having me. My mom is actually originally from Nebraska, came down here because her dad got a job. She's really smart, actually. My dad, his dad had left when he was real little. And so, when I came on the scene for them, I'm their only child. My mom has two other, what I consider my brother and sisters as well, from another guy. But what that looked like, honestly, was, you use the word instability. I think it's a fair word. I wouldn't have thought of it as instability when I was younger, right? And so I'm finding even this now as we have fostered to adopt ourselves, and it's just normal. It is what it is. So, grew up homeless, slept in cars, parks, porches. Your mom or dad going in and out of jail or prison, and then you kind of find your place wherever you are. It didn't seem like it was an odd childhood. There's a lot of freedom, obviously, because nobody really cares that much. It all kind of comes to head. When I was in 8th grade, there was a drug bust that ends up taking place. My mom, who, I don't know how much detail you want, but this is just a fun fact. So when you're on meth, this is what my mom and dad did meth. When you're on meth, you have these really high highs. So you're up for a couple days where you're just grinding on whatever you get fixated on. Well, my mom ends up getting fixated. She wants to build a car from the ground up, and she does. This is before YouTube or whatever it is. She builds this car from the ground up, gets pieces from the junkyard. She's a really bright lady. She drives us to Texas, Granbury, Texas, this tiny little town outside of even Weatherford, which is a tiny town of itself. We end up getting there, and we end up getting stuck there because we have no funds. My mom ends up and her boyfriend ended up manufacturing meth and producing it to that small little town. Then there's a drug bust in Texas. So that's when the first time I go into foster care officially. I end up going, my brother, my sister, and I, we all end up going to foster care. My dad ends up getting out of prison. He's able to get me. And then my brother and sister have to stay there because they have a different dad. Their dad is in prison for murder for life. So they've got to stay in. My mom's in prison. Their dad's in prison. My dad ends up coming and bringing me back to the Valley, Phoenix. And so, I had there was a lot in that I had to work through just as I became an adult, because the older brother, leaving my younger brother and sister and all that stuff. So when I come back here, to kind of keep the story a little bit short, my sophomore year, I just decided I can't do this anymore. I ended up becoming a believer, and that's a crazy story in itself, which I can tell you if you want, but I ended up becoming a believer, and I just I can't do this anymore. So I decided I'm going to quit the basketball team, go get a job, and just move out and just go to school, finish high school, and work. And a guy on the team, who now is my adopted brother, says, well, let me talk to my parents. And his family adopts me in high school, my sophomore year. Wow. So my sophomore year, I become a believer. I meet my what is now wife, which is crazy. And then I get adopted by this family. So it's a little wild year for me. And so, then that takes place. And obviously I get to grow up in that home. And it really was the church that helped me navigate becoming an adult. And I don't just say that because I'm a pastor. It was the church. It was men in the church that taught me how to be a man. It was my adopted parents who are believers that taught me what it looks like to have family dynamics. I mean, it was the classic story. The first night I stayed, I was storing away food, like the cheesy cliche story that you hear, the first night it was just it was a bizarre, situation to be in. So that was kind of some of my story in that. Obviously became a believer and started to pursue towards the end of my kind of high school life, really pursue what does it look like to be a pastor? Really feel like I want to do this. And so I started going into that. So I don't know if that colors kind of some of my story a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. I might have to dig into a few of these things. Do you remember that day that you entered foster care? Do you remember the feelings you had, let's start there. Yeah,
totally. I mean, at the time, if some instability is kind of the consistently inconsistent, the foster care became a consistent, when we officially brought into foster care, there was a consistent a side of life that honestly we just weren't ready for. So I'm 3 years older than my brother and 2 years older than my sister. We end up going into a home somewhere in Texas. I don't remember where it is. And there were all these rules. We had to call them ma'am and sir. That home itself was kind of weird. There was tape all over the house, and certain colors tape you could cross over. I didn't want to get into it. It was weird. The whole thing was weird. Anyway, but
how old were you again at this point?
I was 13 at the time. Yeah. So my brother would have been 10. And so, but I mean, based on going to stay with a friend or sleeping on a mountainside in a tent, it was just different. That was a different dynamic. Now that you're in a house, I'm not kidding. I remember going to foster care, and they took us to Walmart, and they said, you each get $100 because school is getting ready to start. You each get $100 to buy whatever you want for school, like shoes, pants. And we looked at each other. We're like, what? $100? I remember being so fascinated that we got to go pick these clothes. It was wild. So anyway, all that to say is, there was kind of a culture shock in a good way and a bad way. Obviously, even though that's true, the reality is I would have preferred at 13 years old to still be in my broken situation with my parents, because I don't know. That's all I knew. Right. So I hate these foster parents. I hate the system, and they're just trying to do what they know is best. And so I'd still rather be in that broken situation because that's all you know. So I do remember that moment, and it was it was culture shock for sure.
I think that's really important what you just said about you'd rather be in the broken situation because it's what you know. The unknown is scarier than our known reality.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, it is. I think that's true probably just for human existence in general. But for a little kid, I mean, we got it now. We have a 1-year-old that we're fostering right now. He's got a 5-year-old brother, and we can't take him because of bed space and what we're licensed for. But we've said, he can come stay with us when we're ready. If this moves to adoption, we definitely want to adopt him. But he, they were neglected. He was raising his 1-year-old, a little brother. And he wants to stay in the placement center. He wants to stay with his mom, even though it was a terrible situation. And I get it. I totally get it. I resonate with that just as a kid. I'm sure he's got a lot of emotions going on inside of him.
I'm sure he does. Do you remember, was there a point when you started to realize like, okay, this life, my childhood was not normal compared to other kids? Like, was there a moment when you kind of recognized that? Yeah.
So, as a kid, I always remember being embarrassed by the clothes I wore and all that stuff. That was kind of a normal deal. I don't think that was I just thought we're poor. It is what it is.
Yeah.
It wasn't. It's interesting because I don't remember if we were on air or off air when you had said, I'm sorry that your childhood was tough.
Yeah.
I did not wrestle with that until about, 5 years ago. I went and saw a counselor here locally for about a year and a half. And about towards the end of our time, about a year in, he asked me a really, I thought, kind of heart-churning question that really changed my outlook on my childhood. He said, you don't seem to think what happened in your childhood was a big deal. And I don't really feel like I have a bunch of scars. And then he said, okay, so let me ask you this. Would you be okay with your kids going through what you went through? Right. And I thought, I just remember going, not in a million years. Like, no, like definitely not. So I think looking back now, I can see some of those things. You're wearing shoes, the same shoes for 3 years, and I'm using white out to color them to make them look different each school year. And those type of things, I think kind of, they mess with you now that I look back, so there's definitely pieces for sure that I look back on now that I go, that was different. But again, as a kid, I just thought we were poor, and we're in the ghetto. There's a little area here called Sunny Slope. That's where I grew up. And in that area, it's just everybody was kind of that way. So I may have been maybe a little more broken than others, but there's a lot of brokenness kind of surrounding, those ghetto areas anyway. So I don't know if I stood out as much as I would have now, or my kids would in their situations, but.
Yeah. Wow. It's interesting when you said that. I remember a time when I was meeting with a counselor as well, which I'm a huge fan of counseling.
Yeah.
I tell my kids, side note, it's not if you go to counseling, it's when. Like, Cabes do counseling. That's what we do. It's important. Anyways, but I remember I was really struggling with really harsh words to myself. Feeling that perfectionist mindset, and that can still creep in. But this was really helpful to me because my counselor asked me the same question. Would you ever say the things you say to yourself to your kids?
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, no way. Like, you're a loser, you're a failure, you idiot. No.
Yep.
And that really, and she said, well, you're God's kid. And it made me realize it's a responsibility I have to treat myself with respect as I would want to treat others.
No, totally. Absolutely. And I think that's where you start to realize some of this stuff. Everybody's broken. It's crazy.
Oh, man.
It's just everybody's messed up. It's just, you either got people who go to counselors or liars, and they're just trying to figure out, there's just so much going on within us. And
we're complex.
Yeah. We see it in our parenting a lot. It's crazy.
So true. Okay. So you talked about how God saved you, how you became a believer. I would love to hear that story.
Yeah. So the way it happens is I got a best friend growing up. His mom and my mom were best friends growing up. And his mom ends up passing away probably 2 years prior to the moment where we became believers. And what happened was he stayed the night at my house. We ended up staying up all night long playing a video game called Twisted Metal video game. Anyway, we ended up playing it. We lay down, and it's probably 4 or 5 a.m. We lay down, and he goes, "Hey, John, when we die, do you think we're going to go to heaven?" And I give all the cliche answers. Of course, we're good people and blah, blah, blah. Well, he goes on to tell me, like I said, with people who are on meth, his mom and my mom did meth together. And he goes on to tell the fact that his mom, before she passed away, she got fixated. Like my mom got fixated on the car. She got fixated on the book of Revelation for whatever reason. And so at night, she would tell him these stories of Revelation. So he's kind of telling me an interpretation of, well, let's just start. Revelation is already bizarre. Now you're reading Revelation through the lens of meth. And then it's through the revelation of this, 14-year-old kid who's heard it from his mom who's on meth.
Goodness.
So he's telling me all this crazy stuff. And he's like, well, I'm glad we're going to heaven. He falls asleep and I do not fall asleep. I'm like, there's going to be like scorpions coming from the sky. I'm so scared. So I wake him up at like 7 a.m. Like, dude, we're going to go find a church. We go find this church. It's not open. It doesn't have service till night. We end up going there that night. Highly charismatic church. The room, honestly, maybe had 30 people, and it was a tiny, tiny church in the middle of the ghetto. And they're just, they're waving flags, randomly speaking in tongues. The whole thing was wild. It's like, this is just like at home. So we sit through the whole service and kind of snicker and laugh the whole time. But this woman comes up and gives this opportunity to accept Jesus, and I hear what she has to say, and I go, I want to be about this. And I don't know if it was still fear driven or what it was, but I remember we walked home and I felt like I floated home. Wow. I knew there was something different, and I'm like, I'm there. I knew they had something for the youth on Wednesday night, so I was just going to figure it out. So I bring all the little hood rats with me, all my friends, and we just go to this small little church, and there's like 25 or 30 of us. This guy named Luke just starts teaching us the Bible. He just starts walking through Ephesians, teaching me how to read the Bible. I read the Gospel of John. They told me between that week to just go home and read John. So I read it probably 20 times. I had no idea what it said or what it was talking about, but I just knew something was different. And so, that's how I came to faith. Eric, my buddy, ended up coming to faith later, about I think 6 months or a year later, actually reading the Left Behind series, which is, so I've got a bunch of theology that I work through to this day and how I came to faith and all that stuff now that it's changed. But regardless, that was what God had used in our lives at the time. So that's how I came to faith and really made some decisions that I felt like I wanted to kind of get out of that world.
I think that is just so incredible. I love our God, right?
Totally.
He uses a mom on meth to preach.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
To her son, and who preaches to you. How crazy is that?
Oh, yeah. The doctrine of regeneration, obviously now, I don't want to get all pastoral, but like just that God changes our hearts and he does something is so beautiful that like I have no right in coming to faith. There's no reason or nothing I bring to the table. This, kid of meth addict parents, there's nothing that I bring to the table that Jesus would go, I really want that guy on my team. And so it's just like, no, like he's going to do what he wants, how he wants, when he wants. And I find that encouraging to know that we're brought to the table because of what he's done.
Yeah. Yeah. And that we're all, our ministry is called the Forgotten Initiative. And a lot of the reason that we chose that name is because I started to see this whole world of foster care and how these agency workers, foster parents, birth parents, and their kids are often kind of invisible to the rest of us, are forgotten, and yet not to God, right? And like each one of us, he knows us by name. He knows us intimately. And I know I do not understand that, but I'm grateful. I'm grateful for it.
Yep. Yeah, me too.
So you mentioned there was some people. You mentioned the church. Talk about the people that walked with you, that helped you, because we have a lot of people who love Jesus who listen to this podcast, and a lot of people who are foster parents, but a lot that are also, they care about this community and how can they help and how can the church make a difference. So what did people do? How did they walk with you? How did that make a difference for you?
Yeah. So it's some of it just understanding the variables of a boy becoming a man. Maybe that's probably the best way to start. So you got the structure that doesn't exist, things that when I went into foster care that I was grateful for. I remember when my adopted mom, Nancy, made me do my homework for the first time. Nobody had ever made me do my homework before. And I remember feeling so loved, confused, frustrated, but loved by that whole thing. And so there's things that you just don't learn as without parents. I mean, parents, that is our role. That is God's ordained part of family. And so because I didn't have that transition, men specifically, but I want to say to all your listeners, the church at large, sometimes we take for granted the role the church plays in our societies, but specifically in raising men and women, like generational Christians, like what that looks like and what that means. And, there were men, a guy named Dan Broder, John Young, my adopted dad, like I mentioned, Luke Moosefeld. There's guys that came alongside me and taught me how to be a man. I remember watching them discipline their children and being wildly confused by that, and them explaining it to me, calling me out on all my junk. Like, that's not, you don't treat people how you feel, right? You don't use those words. And just like, they shaped me in how to be a man. They taught me my work ethic. You put the trash out at this time. So I'm living with them. I'm not just like learning this from afar. I'm watching my adopted father get up before everyone gets up and the last to go to bed every single day, every day. That was what, and so you learn, you're going, like my idea of manhood is just completely skewed. Like, I'm watching these men. These are men, like manly men. And they're loving their wives. You don't talk to their wives so there's a sense of like, they taught me. And then on the other side, I'll do my best not to get emotional, but then all the mothers of the church, like who like, to this day, it's hard for me, even when I hug my adopted mom, like there's a sense of like, you get just emotional. Like the women of the church that rallied around me, my mother-in-law, my adopted mom, the pastors' wives that came alongside me, and the leaders that taught me what good affection means and how to talk to women in respectable ways, and to not allow like me to get away with stupid stuff that teenagers, if I had parents, wouldn't let me get away with. So it was the church, and I mean that it was the church that God used that to make me the way that I am. I am formed forever. I have habits based on what people in the church have taught me through those formative years. So I could go on and on with lists of scripture memory, and from that when to spank and not to spank, and things that you just didn't and I didn't know. So I don't know if that helps, but those are things that I definitely learned.
And what I'm hearing is it was just church people being uniquely them. It wasn't, they didn't need to have some certain special power or special gift or special, I guess my point here is it's easy for us to think, oh, I couldn't make a difference in someone's lives because I would need to do this or that. Like, these people were just being them. They were just living their lives in front of you and with you. Right. Yeah.
So I would actually add to that. Not only are they being them, and this is really important, I think, for foster parents and parents in general, they apologized. So this is a unique thing that, like, I think sometimes we forget in our faith that is filled with grace and mercy, that when they messed up, like I remember very specifically one of the guys said, hey, I said that. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. And thinking, wait, what? Like, you're the authority, and so they're not only are they don't have superpowers, they are unbelievably flawed, and they acknowledge their mistakes and their hiccups and their gaps. And so I thought that was profoundly beautiful as I'm learning that. And I didn't really honestly pick that up until I had kids. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've apologized to my own kids, said, I honestly shouldn't raise my voice. That was not okay. I shouldn't have said that. That wasn't okay. I'm doing that because I think I was being insecure. I need Jesus just like you need Jesus. So I think that was a flavor of the church that was different than teachers I had. That was different than other parental authorities that were kind of out there. I'd watch the church folk, and they were just different. Their vibe was different. Their approach was different. So that was, I think, a lesson in that. They were flawed for sure, but they acknowledged that. So anyway, I thought that was beautiful and worth adding.
Oh, I love that. I think that's incredible. I've been thinking a lot about, I read this book called The Good News of Our Limitations. I think that's the name of it. Sean McGever, I believe is his name. But just the reality that we are limited people, like it's not a surprise. We know this, but yet I think, at least I know I have so many times felt guilty for not being able to be more or be all to everyone, and when you really get down to it, it's like I am trying to be God to my kids or be God to others, and I'm not the savior, right? Like he is. But why do then we sometimes feel guilty for being human?
Yeah, right.
And I think that acknowledging your flaws, acknowledging your limitations, speaking that to others, like you said, is actually one of the most beautiful things we can do for others.
Yeah. I've watched my kids personally. We've got 3 biological, 1 adopted, and we're in the process of adopting 2 more right now. I've watched my kids, their hearts gravitate more towards us when we apologize.
Yes.
They're not pushing away. They're wanting to be more. And so I feel like it's an invitation.
Oh, I completely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. You're going to have 6 kiddos. Is that what I'm hearing? Did I do the math right?
Yeah. So we've got 3 biological, 14-year-old, 12, and 9, 1 adopted. She is 6. We picked her up from the hospital. We're in the process right now to foster to adopt 2 more, but I don't know how it works in your state, but you kind of have the tracks of direct adoption where you can do private adoption overseas, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. You can open your bed for any rights that are severed for a kid that has their rights severed, or you can do foster to adopt, which, if you do private adoption, you're paying financially, but if you do foster to adopt, you're paying emotionally because you don't know what's going to happen. So we've got 2 kiddos right now. They're not siblings. One's a 8-week-year-old. She's coming off fentanyl, meth, just a real tough situation. And then a 1-year-old who was left with his 5-year-old brother that I told you about. Was kind of left to be raised by him. We're in the process moving in that direction, but you never know. You never know. It's such a tension, right? You've got kids who you would love to keep, but if you keep them, what that means is their parents have failed. Right. And so it's like, okay, well, I don't want their parents to fail and go back on drugs. But I also don't want to lose these kids. It's awful. Right. It's essentially
it's such an emotional thing. Yes.
It is. And it's a solution only that can be found in a broken situation. It's just broken. The whole thing is just broken. So it shouldn't be this way, but it is. But that's where we are right now. We're on the way to be that family. I didn't think we'd be that family, but I'm all about it. I'd adopt 50, but I got to get my wife on board sometimes for some of that.
Well, I'll tell you, we have 7 kids. And when we had 6, we're like, we started to feel the nudge. What's 1 more? Well, we don't have any more after 7.
Yeah. Exactly.
1 more is still 1 more. 7 is so, yeah. So I think that maybe you wouldn't adopt 50.
Yeah. You're probably right. That's a big van.
It is a big van. Yes. It's a big black van that I can actually stand all the way up in the back. It's one of those high tops.
So that's what we're looking for right now. Honestly,
you are.
We've got a Sienna. I don't know. This probably isn't permanent information to your listeners, but we got an 8-passenger Sienna. So if we ever want to take kids, I also volunteer coach basketball. I sometimes got to take, we just have no room. So I'm like, let's just go and get the 15-passenger van and be those people. Let's just get it done.
Totally. Yeah. We call ours the Gentle Giant.
Yeah, I like that. All right.
Yeah, it's our van is coming to the end of its time, though. We're like 270,000 miles, and yeah, we've loved it well.
Oh wow.
Anyways, okay, so I want to talk about that message that I heard that first introduced me to you. You called it the Theology of Life. So first, why did you title it that? And I know I did not hear the whole message. I listened to a portion of it. But you definitely talked about foster care and the church's response and responsibility. But why did you title that message and just talk about that, the Theology of Life?
Yeah. So, when the Scully leak took place, as elders, we got together and we said, we feel like this is going to be a conversation. The pro-life, pro-choice conversation is going to need to happen. Mm-hmm. We want our people to be equipped, not just so they can have fodder to, ammo to throw to the other side, but just know why we believe what we believe in some of that.
Yeah.
So we put it on the calendar, and then obviously Roe v. Wade was overturned. So the Theology of Life, we usually teach through the Bible verse by verse. We're in the book of Matthew right now. Mm-hmm. But once a year, we'll take a little section and do something where we feel like culturally this needs to be talked about. And we felt like this was pertinent enough to talk about. So it was actually 3 weeks. The Theology of Life was 3 weeks, 3 little mini-week series. And the first one was, if I was to give a manifesto of the pro-life, what it means, why we are theologically pro-life, what does it mean biblically, what is it? Let me just walk us through. So that was the first sermon that we did there. And then there's a response to that, was a little more philosophical. Another elder named Richard Claus who taught that one. And then the last one was what you had listened to, which was, okay, all that's true. If God has answered our prayers, that pro-life, that abortion would stop. So if that's the case, then let's start talking about the repercussions of that. And in 5 years, there's going to be more kids in foster care than there are right now. So We can't be just as what the world is accusing us, being pro-birth and not pro-life.
Yes,
We've got to be all in. And so the response to holding this doctrine of being pro-life is having a big doctrine of foster care and adoption. So that's what we focus on, and that's where that kind of grew out of. And, there's obviously, specifically for that sermon, I just wanted to tackle the most well-known verse. So it's James 1:27. You got Romans 8 that talks about adoption, or Matthew 19, let the little children come to me. But James 1:27, and I just wanted to unpack for us as a church, and honestly, like a lot of our church who's grown up in modern evangelicalism, when you look at that verse, and I won't preach here, but just when you look at that verse, you hear pure and undefiled religion is this. Okay, cool. Well, it's a two-parter in what James gives us. One is to keep yourself unspotted from the world, which most have grown up understanding that. We understand individual righteousness. We understand that the ways of the world are in front of us, and we need to keep ourselves separated from that. We get that. The unfortunate side is that what we don't hear is the other side, but also you need to be a caretaker or a watcher, the language is, of the orphan and the widow. And it's just unfortunate that, I'm sure you're aware of this. Modern evangelicalism right now is kind of getting into the timeline that has been going on for the last 100 years. And that is, you're either pro-social justice and more liberal, or you're conservative and you care about truth and what is biblically right. And the reality is what James is putting in front of us is what is biblically right. Holiness and righteousness matter. That is part of pure and undefiled religion. Also, what matters is taking care of the orphan and the widow. And and I just told our church, I said, we're not going to let the world set our narrative. The Bible's putting in front of us, whether you want to be accused of being liberal or conservative, that's not our concern. Our concern is doing both of these really well. So we want to live for holiness and be a pure, righteous people, but we're also going to give our lives away for God, for the people that God tells us to see that we normally don't see. And so, that's where that came out of. Just last thing I'll say on that is specifically with that, I think what James is putting in front of us is the fact that we are to be, the language I use in that sermon is caretakers, like in the same way that a nurse is a caretaker. Well, ultimately the orphan is God's authority. God is over the orphan. He's got the orphan, but he has given not our tax dollars, not Biden, not the government, the caretaker role. He's given the church. And so every child that is in foster care and adoption right now is the church's responsibility. And I'm sure, you've had people come on this podcast and say that a million times, but biblically that's true. So that's what I think that infinitive word is being used there. It's not just to see or oversee, but to be a caretaker, to be somebody who advocates for that. And so that's what I wanted to push our people towards. I keep talking, so I apologize. But
no, this is awesome.
Yeah, in that idea, like in our state, I'll just say this: there's 18,000 kids in foster care right now. There's 4 families that get licensed every single day for us. So of those 4, that's great. The problem is there's 33 new kids that come into the system every day on average. Wow. So in our state, the state of Arizona, there's a little over 500,000 Protestant evangelicals, I think 534,000 or something like that. We could easily, I think that's just even in Maricopa County, we could easily go at this problem. And that doesn't require everyone to foster to adopt. But if you're 19 years old and you're like, hey, I can't just quite foster to adopt yet, then you can come alongside a family and babysit, or you could do something. If you're an older couple, maybe you can foster, but you can't adopt. But at some level, we have to acknowledge nobody in the church can say, that's not my job. No, it is your job. At some level, you have to partake and get involved with the orphan because he calls us to see the orphan. And so anyway, I'm going to get all fired up right now, but that's where I'm not trying to be that guy that's like, oh, that's just your thing. It's not just my thing. It was never just my thing. It's a Bible thing. And so that's where the Bible's pushing us. And so we just want to acknowledge it for what it is.
Wow. I love that. And I love there's this middle ground that culture wants to polarize us, everybody, right? But there's this both and thing that you're talking about that I think there's a lot of us in that middle ground, but those voices are quieter, right? People like to.
Of course, the algorithms on social media don't.
They don't pick up those.
Of course.
Yeah. So, but I appreciate what you're saying. I love that, and I completely agree. Like, that is justice. But yeah, there's truth and there's justice, and the Lord calls us to both.
Yes. Amen.
Do you share with your church very much about your personal story?
Yeah, I do. Again, we're just every Sunday we're going through the Bible verse by verse, chapter by chapter. And so there's moments where it pertains to certain situations, but I've shared my story, my testimony. We always want to share God's stories and goodness. So that takes place probably more in home communities where we can kind of interact and share each other's stories at least once a year and hear what God is doing. Now there's just wild things that compound. So I'll give you a great example. I'm almost forced to share my story because we're getting ready to move into our building that we call it a mission. So we're moving into our mission where the saints gather on Sunday. We have these other programs that we do throughout the week. But the first wedding that will take place in our mission is my dad. So my dad so it's weird. For my dad, I've always kind of been the adult in the relationship. And so he, a couple of years ago, was like, Sean, I need you to teach me about Jesus. So he got clean. And so it's just a weird, there's stuff like that goes, my story still happening. I mean, God in real time is giving me grace and showing me how he's still alive and well. So there's that. My mom's clean now too. She's actually still in Dallas. She's a Jehovah's Witness. And so there's certain elements that I still continue to pray for her and all that. But I share my story when it's helpful. As my kids are getting older, I share more and more with them. But they're aware of some of that as well. Wow.
That's really cool. Well, Sean, as we kind of start to close out here, you're now a husband, obviously you're a father of 4, almost 6, church planter. You actually planted this church. Yep. You're a pastor. Obviously you're passionate about this, God's work, the gospel. What is your dream for your church?
So for us, just a little bit of philosophy, I can keep this in 30 seconds. I mentioned we're moving into a mission. So we operate as a mission model. So if you're familiar with missions of 16th, 17th century within Catholicism, they'd go to an unreached area, these Spanish missionaries, and they would immediately build a building. Now, we know these as Spanish missions. If you think of Spanish mission architecture, there's actually 21 missions in California. The Alamo is a mission. So those were all the idea was to go to an area and let that space be used for what the city needs in that area. So it would be used as food houses, schoolhouses, town hall meetings, all that stuff. So what we're doing is we want to plant missions in low-income areas. That's the way that Pella operates. In working poor areas, we want to go into those spaces. And so our first mission is in this area, downtown Glendale. And we're getting actually ready to move into our mission. We've been meeting in this comedy lounge for the last, 20 months. And so we're getting ready to move in there on the 4th. And my hope would be that it plays both ways. So these Spanish missions, what would happen is all these programs would go in these unreached areas for 6 days a week. And then on the 7th day, the way that the church would operate is they'd close everything down and the saints would gather in the mission. So the locals knew hey, that's a resource for me throughout the week, but also that's where holiness and righteousness, because obviously that's how non-believers usually think of things. I'm going to go to church, right? And so that's what we want to be. We want to be a beacon of hope tangibly, but also on Sundays, that's where the saints gather, right? And so they know, hey, wedding ceremonies are there, funerals are there, food can be found there, showers can be found there, but also at the same time on Sunday, the church gets together there. So we're doing certain tangible things to do that well. We'll have a 24-hour coffee shop for the city that will use kids who are aging out of the foster care system as employees. And there's certain things that we're doing to try to operate that. And there's some great coffee shop called Cultivate out here that is doing some stuff really well with that. So my hope would be that we would fulfill that dream, to live as the missions of old and be that continue, and then do it again, and then do it again, and do it again, plant those kind of churches. There's so many good churches in Phoenix, so we don't feel like we're reinventing the wheel. We don't feel like we're the answer. We're just part of it. We feel like this is where God's calling us.
Amen. I connect with that a lot. That's how I feel about TFI. It's one way to serve the foster care community, to serve the church, really, because we believe the foster care community needs the church as much as the church needs the foster care community. Yep. But we're not the only way. We're not necessarily the best way. We're just our way, right? Yep. And we need everybody to do their thing so that all together, God's glory can just continue to change lives.
Amen. Amen. Appreciate all your guys' work in that too. It's pretty awesome.
Well, thank you. Do you have a vision this is my last question, but a vision for the church, Big C Church at large?
Well, I'm guessing Jesus does. So whatever. No, I mean, specifically in this area, it's just, it's hard for me to answer that because some of it feels like modern evangelicalism. We need to kind of turn a little bit and check our priorities. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that's been called out in the last couple of years through podcasts in regards to kind of the direction in which the church cares about celebrity and platform, maybe more than it does to recognize that the people of God have always been the marginalized and always have identified with the lowly. That's every year. We started last year. We're going to keep doing this. We're going to go through something called the All Called 8, where for an entire month we pray for 8 specific people groups. And I hope the church at large would pick up on that it's the naked, it's the thirsty, it's the hungry, it's the orphan, it's the widow that the church needs to associate with. It's the broken. And then as saints, we care about righteousness. So I don't know. I'm not that big to be able to think for a big church at large. I hope, though, I will say for what you guys are doing, that if the big church at large stepped up in the area of foster care and adoption, we can really move some things at government levels. I mean, right now, I think, I might be wrong, but last I read, I think it's 70% of people who are in the foster care and adoption process, or maybe 65, are Christians, claim to be Christians. So that's saying something right there, that more than half of the people who adopt are Christians. And so that speaks to our God. I hope more people pick up on that. It's not a trend or a fad. It's just reality of Scripture.
That's right. Well, Sean, I appreciate your openness, your passion, and your humility, and just really bless you and everything you're doing there. It sounds like incredible work and just gospel work, and just keep it up. And thank you for being on today.
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy, for having me so much. I really do appreciate it.
Well, I hope that today's episode encouraged you wherever you are on your foster care journey. We want you to stay connected, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will never miss an episode. Also, we have great content at theforgotteninitiative.org. Thank you for watching. I cannot wait to be with you next time.